So the recording will go on YouTube, and it will include resource lists that Constance has recommended and that we have at the Oakland Public Library.
Awesome, fantastic, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about some stories specifically involving trees that highlight the way we interact with the species around us and how those tree species have impacted our local human culture. But before I get into all of that, wanted to quickly introduce the East Bay Regional Park District in case you're not familiar. We are a special district. We are a governmental agency, but we are our own thing. So we are not city, we are not state, we are not federal, we are not county. We are our own little governmental agency, and we exist only in Alameda and Contra Costa counties. And our sole purpose is to manage the land that has been put under the care of the district. So we have about 73 parks. We have thousands of miles of trails, and also thousands of acres of open space. So if you have ever seen this little leaf down here, that is the logo to look for, and then you know you are on East Bay Regional Park District areas. So in the area where our parks are, this is also territory of Ohlone peoples. And the story of Oakland and the East Bay is inextricably linked to the past and present of these indigenous cultures. And I say cultures because Ohlone actually refers to a number of different cultures and languages as well. And I'll get into that a little bit further into the presentation. So I'm going to follow two different tracks today. And there are two different species who will guide us on each of these tracks. The redwood will be our tree to guide us through change, and the oak will be our tree to guide us through human culture, specifically the coast live oak. And we're also going to do a lot of tree ID along the way, so hopefully you will get to know a couple of the common trees around here if you are not already familiar with them. So first, we are going to start with some redwood ID. What the heck is a redwood? And a place where you can see them is right here in Reinhardt Regional Redwood area. And this is our coast redwood. And also, folks, if you see my little face in the corner here and it's blocking anything like a picture or a word, you can just click and drag on your box right down there or wherever is convenient for you. So one of the ways to tell a redwood from other trees is, some people say it's the red bark. I've always kind of had a hard time seeing that. I can see it's got like a reddish tinge to it, but I feel like a lot of other barks have a reddish tinge, at least as far as the way that my eyes see color. One of the things that really helped me was when I was told to look at the leaflets. So right here, we've got some leaflets here, the little needles. And you'll notice that they are only on the horizontal plane of this stem right here. So you don't have stems growing on the top and bottom, you really only have them growing out to the sides. So that's one dead giveaway as far as redwoods are concerned. And the leaflets are usually pretty small. They're maybe about an inch or so long. And they also have these teeny tiny little cones here. They're probably about the size of a grape, which is pretty incredible when you think about redwoods coming from seeds. Now, within these cones, you have about 40 to 70 seeds in these cones, and those seeds are like half the size of a grain of rice. They're tiny. And those tiny seeds can grow into one of the largest organisms on Earth. So redwood trees are actually the tallest trees on Earth. I'll get to what some of the other taller trees are later. So you might wonder, gosh, that seems so difficult to have a giant, giant tree growing from something half the size of a grain of rice. Well, that is not usually how redwoods reproduce. They usually reproduce through sprouting. Whoopsie. Through sprouting right here. So if you are out in a redwood forest, you will often see these little shoots coming out from the trunk of the tree. Can you see my little arrow? I don't know if you can answer me, Emily, when I am kind of using it as a little pointer here.
I can see your arrow, yes.
Perfect, thank you. So this is usually the way redwoods regrow because it's a lot easier, frankly. So when you're out and you see these, they're tiny little redwood shoots and they are clones of the parent tree. So if you see like a redwood circle, redwoods will stump sprout, and then the trees will grow up and they'll be growing in a circle. Some people call them a fairy ring. Those are likely to be genetically identical trees. And so that's where the seeds come in. The seeds introduce different genetic material into the population so they can adapt to change. Redwoods are also really, really fire resistant. You might have heard at Big Basin. There was a big fire there very recently, and some of the old growth redwoods survived. They're very, very fireproof. They have extremely thick bark that protects them not only from fire, but also from insect infestation. Oh, and that's one of the reasons why people say sometimes that redwoods are immortal, because they can keep having their progeny sprout from them essentially for as long as they're left alone. So this is the Hyperion redwood. It's the tallest tree in the world. And here is the Hyperion redwood towering above all the other trees around it. And here's the trunk of the Hyperion. And the reason that I wanted to bring up the Hyperion is to take us to the very beginning of the story of the land we now call Oakland. Now, it's thought that the Hyperion tree is around 600 to 800 years old, whereas it's thought the average redwood tree could live up to 2,000 years old, which is wild. That's super old. And these trees used to cover most of our northern hemisphere until the last ice age. And the Ice Age and the Pleistocene is kind of when we start getting the coastline that we are so familiar with today. And so what I want you to do is imagine the Oakland Hills covered in trees that are like the Hyperion tree, these massive, massive redwood trees that Oakland was actually known for before it was for oaks. So you have all these massive trees in the hills, and then you come down into the flatlands. And believe it or not, you could keep walking out through the Golden Gate and all the way out past the Farallon Islands 14,000 years ago, which is pretty incredible. This is called the Farallon Plains right here. So the Pleistocene was the last ice age, and it was about 2.6 million years ago to 11,000 years ago. And this was what we're looking at here, this coastline at 14,000 years ago. This was coming to the end of the last ice age. The ice age ended approximately 10,000 years ago. The glaciers were melting, sea level was rising, and water was creeping further and further inland. And so as it did, it finally settled around 10,000 years ago to the coastline we have today. And that's also when the bay filled in. That's when Lake Merritt filled in. So Lake Merritt, if you did not know, Lake Merritt is about 10,000 years old, which is pretty wild. The other really amazing thing is that before the water came this far inland, what we know as the bay today was actually a giant valley. It was a huge valley, it was a grassland, and there were massive mammals who lived all over the Bay Area. Archaeologists call the Bay Area in that era the California Serengeti, because there were so many incredible species of megafauna. We had saber-toothed cats, we had American lions, we had American cheetah, we had mammoths, we had camelops, which are ancient camels, we had ancient horses, we had these animals, the short-faced bear, which were these massive bears, bigger than grizzly bears, and they chased down their prey. It's thought that they could run up to 40 miles an hour to chase down prey. That is pretty wild. And then of course we have our condors over here. So this is from a really amazing book called State of Change, which we'll have in our resources by Laura Cunningham. And if you have never heard of this book and are interested in what landscapes and ecology was like in California pre-colonization, this is, and even pre-human, this is a great place to start. So we still have a lot of Ice Age mammals around here. We have deer, gray fox, coyote, mountain lion, bobcats. There's quite a few still around. But what kind of trees were here? I'm going to start in on some tree identification of some common trees. And one of the reason we know what kind of trees were here is because of the fossil record. So when the Caldecott Tunnel was being excavated, the Orinda Formation was discovered in there, and it was found that there were plant fossils from 10 million years ago. 10 million years ago. And so they were able to find these fossils of essentially the ancestors of our modern trees. And so those fossils were very, very similar to the plants who are still here today. So we have the California Bay. You might be familiar with this one from your kitchen. It has very, very aromatic leaves. The leaves are probably about 3 to 4 inches long. They kind of look like a glossy surfboard here. They are an evergreen tree. And you can also eat them as well. So FYI, there is no collecting in the parks, but these trees are everywhere. And when I say eat them, I don't mean like salad greens. I mean like using them like bay leaves to flavor different food. And they actually are a lot stronger than the European bay leaves you can buy in the grocery store. So it's recommended you use about half. And they have these cool fruit here. If they look like tiny little avocados to you, maybe, that is because the California Bay is actually in the laurel family. So it is related to avocados. And if you open this up, you will get a brown nut on the inside. If you roast it, they taste like coffee beans, and similar to coffee beans, they have a mild stimulating effect as well. And this is kind of how they often grow, not always, but I'll often see them like this, especially if it's along a creek or something like that, or along a canyon with these very sort of downturned branches. Our next tree slash bush is a willow. The difference between trees and bushes are that trees generally have a straight stalk or trunk and then a crown, whereas bushes tend to have, you know, branches sticking out all over the place, starting from the bottom. Willows can grow very tree-like, and our native ones can too. But this is something you'll see around here a lot, and this is also a plant that a lot of things are named out of after. You might have heard the word salsal creek. That is Spanish for willow.
Hey, excuse me, Constance. I just want to say, sometimes you're hitting the mic, so just be careful when you're moving, I think, because there's a little bit of a disruption that's happening.
Oh, is there? Okay,
yeah.
Sorry about that. That is good. Okay, great. We'll try to be aware of that. So one of the things that you want to look for as far as identification are these narrow green leaves, and they'll be often a little bit paler colored on the back. And especially when they're in flower, they're very, very obvious. They have these big old long flowers called catkins. And so definitely keep an eye out for willows along creek beds and wet areas. They're often commonly used as a landscaping plant as well. So you can find them in a lot of planted landscapes. And we have our western sycamore. If you've ever been to Sunol, it's a great place to see western sycamores and a great place to see fall colors. So with fall coming up, you might want to take a visit down there. The sycamores have these light gray puzzle piece patterns on the bark. You can kind of see it on this larger picture as well. They have these deeply lobed leaves. These leaves can almost be mistaken for maple leaves, but the bark is the giveaway. The bark is the difference there. And then the seed pods here are these like furry little balls that look sort of like beads on a string. So this is a really fun tree. They can grow really, really big. Sycamore, riparian, the riparian areas where sycamores grow are, I don't know, I think they're one of my favorite habitats in the Bay Area. So I highly recommend checking out Sunol to see that. And then we have the oaks. There are a number of different types of oaks around here. 3 that you're likely to see are the California black oak, the blue oak, and the valley oak. And these are all deciduous trees, meaning that they lose their leaves once a year. For this black oak, there are tiny little spines or like little pointy bits coming off of the top of each of these lobes. I don't know if you can see that or not, but that is very distinctive of the black oak. We have the blue oak, which have these like bluish grayish leaves, which can be very difficult to tell apart from the valley oak. So one of the things that I heard that really helped me tell the difference is the valley oak has these very deep valleys in between the lobes, whereas the blue oak has these much shallower valleys. And to complicate things, all these oaks can hybridize. So if you're having a hard time identifying an oak, then don't worry, it's not you. It is because oaks can be very tricky to identify. And of course, we have our coast live oak. Now, I started this presentation with the flag of Oakland, which has the coast live oak tree on it. And so this is us getting into our second guide for human culture. And one of the ways you can tell a coast live oak is a coast live oak is it has these down curved leaves. They have little points on them. They're very tough and leathery leaves. And one thing that I did not put a picture of here, unfortunately, is that if you look on the underside of the leaves, between the main leaf vein and then the parts of the vein that come off of the main leaf, you might see some yellow fuzz right kind of like in the apex of where those two leaf veins come apart. And some people call them hairy armpits. They're like little golden leaves, but that is another really fun way to identify coast live oak as well. So I wanted to move even backwards from the founding of Oakland to the culture born on this land. So for the Ohlone peoples who have lived here for thousands of years and continue to live here, oaks play a really large role in culture. So this is just an example of Oakland before colonization, or what it might have looked like. This is also from State of Change, the Laura Cunningham book. And it's thought that people have been in California for about 20,000 to 15,000 years. So, and on top of that, we have the Ohlone cultures today who were born on this land. So it's still Ohlone territory today, even if it looks like this. And this is the exact same scene as this, but in 2003. So she takes landscapes and tries to reimagine them as they were thousands of years ago. So, like I said before, we are in Chochenyo-Ohlone territory, and just in this area alone, in the Bay, there were at least 50 distinct tribes and dozens of languages. So that's why we say Ohlone peoples, because there were many different cultures and many different languages spoken. And this was a rich area, both in cultural diversity and in biodiversity. It's written about that this area pre-colonization, or as the Spanish were coming and colonizing, that this was akin to a Garden of Eden. There was so much food. This was essentially an edible landscape. There was fish in the bay, there were shellfish, there were migrating birds coming through, there were tons of mammals upland that you could hunt. There were grass seeds and flower seeds and fruits and nuts to eat. And so it was a land of abundance. And none of this was by accident. This was all very, very intentional and cultivated by the indigenous peoples who lived here. And one of the ways that that was done was through controlled burns, which is a common cultural way to work with the land. So people had so much food all around them and they didn't need to farm because they were able to work with the land through different ways. One of the things that controlled burning does is it clears out all of the dead brush so you don't get this buildup of fuel and then eventually have it ignite into a raging inferno, kind of similar to what we're seeing today. When you burn off the old growth as well, it clears the way for new shoots to come up and grow. And so you would have a field of fresh green sprouts that would then attract animals like deer and rabbit that you could then hunt. And fire also helped for a lot of plant cultivation. Hazelnuts, for example, is a native hazelnut, a bush type of plant around here. And when it was burned and cultivated and maintained, you had a lot more hazelnuts, you had much bushier bushes, and they were much more productive in a lot of ways. Nowadays, when you don't maintain them, they grow a little more spindly, they don't have as much fruit that they produce, so they are an example of a type of plant that does really, really well under human cultivation, even though it is a wild plant. And again, fire can also help with seed germination. So coffeeberry is a local plant, and I'm realizing now I really should have put pictures of these in here. I don't know why I didn't. My apologies, I will fix that. California lilac, giant sequoias, these are all California native plants that rely on fire for germination, or fire can help them germinate. And in addition to verdant landscapes, another physical legacy from Ohlone ancestors are shell mounds. So these are sacred sites. They are burial grounds for ancestors, and they are also part of our irreplaceable Bay Area heritage. And the biggest and oldest of them all is the West Berkeley Shell Mound, which I will be coming back to later in the program. And this is an illustration of a village, and you can see shell mounds were often closer to the water. And you can see that, you know, it's essentially the best of all worlds. You have the bay you can get food from, you have the uplands you can get food from. And one of the ways that upland areas were cultivated, like I said, were through controlled burns to get, oh, another thing that I wanted to say quickly is even though there were all these trees and many types of trees around here, generally the traditional Ohlone home was made out of tule reeds, not out of trees. And there were these domed homes called rues. So inland, you've got these oak savannas, and these were written about in Spanish journals when they came because they were amazed. They came here and they were like, whoa, this is incredible. It's like this cultivated garden that you can just ride your horse for miles and not have to worry about running into a giant thicket of bushes that you can't get through, or you don't have to worry about being blocked in by different trees. So the oak savanna was a really major part of the landscape at the time. And it still is now, but not as common. So oaks were and are a really big part of Ohlone culture. And one of that reasons is acorns. Major source of food for ancestors and a big part of food culture today for Ohlones. The California black oak was the prized acorn. It has, you can see the seeds are quite big, and the inside flesh was supposed to be really, really sweet and delicious. I have not ever had black oak. I have had some coast live oak before, and it was really good. So I can imagine that the black oak would be quite delicious. The coast live oak was maybe a little bit more common because they create acorns more often. The black oaks do not create acorns every year, but the coast live oaks tend to create acorns a lot more frequently and in more abundance. So often it was the coast live oaks that were used. And you can't just like peel an acorn and eat it raw. There's a little bit of processing you need to do because they have tannins in them, which can make you sick if you don't remove them. So you would have to shell the acorn, pound it up, soak it in water, and then you could eat it. You could make an acorn mush that you could turn into a type of porridge or different sorts of things. It was used in a lot of meals and still is as well as far as cultural traditions go. In times that ancestors did not have as many acorns, buckeyes were thought to have been a food source as well. Now, buckeyes are actually more toxic than acorns, so they took a lot more effort. And my understanding is because they took a lot more effort and they didn't taste as good, they were not really like a go-to food source unless there weren't acorns. So buckeyes are a really common tree you'll see in the landscape here, both planted and out in the wild. You might have seen these big white spikes of flowers. They smell really, really good. And they also have these leaves. They're palmate leaves. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 leaflets per leaf, and it's called palmate because it kind of looks like a palm. And these are actually the first trees to lose their leaves every year and the first ones to get them back. So when you see a buckeye and it's just about to burst into bud again, you know that all the other trees are not far behind it. So they're a really great sign of the seasons changing. You might look for these as well, these weird pear-shaped things. These are actually the husks of the buckeye seed. So this is the buckeye growing. When it's ripe enough, that husk will open up and then out drops this buckeye here. So what happened? What happens to this food forest here? There was a massive shift in culture when the Spanish came to colonize the area in the 1770s. And this, unfortunately, was a dark era for Ohlone ancestors. Ohlone peoples were enslaved by ranchers and missions, and cultural practices were suppressed. And this included prohibiting things like controlled burns and otherwise working with plants to get the things they need, like food and medicine, basket-making materials. And it's important to note also that Ohlone ancestors did fight back both covertly and overtly. People work to keep their traditions alive, which can be seen in the fact that we have a strong Ohlone culture today. And also something that I did not know before I read this book called American Genocide, which is also going to be on the list. Ooh, that's not easy to see. One thing that is mentioned in this book is the roofs of the missions. They used to be thatch. Now we know that, you know, there's that iconic architectural style of mission roofs being that red tile. One of the reasons they are that red tile is indigenous people would resist by lighting the roofs of the missions on fire. And so eventually the missions changed the actual architecture of the roof to be tile instead of thatch. So you can see the legacy of indigenous resistance in the actual architecture of the missions. There was another massive shift in culture. That was the gold rush, 1849, and this again drastically changed the land even more in a very short period of time. And this unfortunately was an even darker time for Ohlone ancestors. Indigenous people were seen as obstacles because those who fought back to defend their land and culture were seen as a nuisance. And so that led to campaigns of state-sponsored genocide in the second half of the 19th century. And the reason I bring this up is because it's so important to think about who was able to freely interact with the land, because that has everything to do with our current landscape and the relationships we have to the ecosystems we live within. So during the gold rush, you start having this massive population influx, and then there's this building boom. So everybody's building stuff. And boy, those Oakland Hills are looking pretty good to the people who are interested in building. So we've got these giant trees, these redwoods. They are 30 feet broad. They are 300 feet tall. It took thousands of years for these trees to grow. And it took about 15 years, from 1845 to 1860, for crews of loggers to level the entire forest in the hills, which is pretty astounding. Many of these stumps were dug out as well, and we had talked about crown sprouting for redwoods. So because the stumps were dug out and used for things like cords of firewood or shingles, a lot of trees in that next generation were prevented from growing. Not all the stumps were taken out, but many of them were. Supposedly only one original tree remains today, or I should say one original tree lives today, not supposedly. It's an old growth redwood. It's very twisted and gnarled, and it's on this basically a cliff face by Merritt College. And it's thought that it was just too much trouble to log it and then actually retrieve the wood because of where it was. So one remaining old growth redwood. So this really, really influenced the culture of Oakland because what's now the Port of Oakland was shipping tons of redwood lumber throughout the bay every single day in the early 1850s. And this is how it was done. It was often done with a team of oxen. And what I've heard is that virtually all the east-west roads in Oakland were planned in relation to the logging camps in the hills to have the oxen and the mule teams drag the wood down to the port so it could get shipped out. So these old growth redwoods were the building material and became the new towns for East Bay and a lot of the city of San Francisco. And it's also, you know, this was not something that was like an organized effort. This was just a free-for-all, grab what you can. At its maximum, there were 10 sawmills operating in the Oakland Hills alone. That is a giant amount of sawmills. And it was just this winner-takes-all competition to get everything. So by the mid-1850s, the biggest trees were gone. And 10 years later, by 1860, all the mills were closed. They had logged themselves out of jobs. So this is another place where we see really clearly the intersections between change and culture and how significant the values of our cultures are in shaping the landscapes we live in, one way or another. So in the decades after we have the logging of the Redwood Hills, we see a shift to agriculture. And this is just an illustration of an estate in Fruitvale. Alameda County was fertile farming territory. So you had grain fields and tons of orchards like almond and cherry and apricot, peach and pear. So if you see old orchards in Oakland or kind of see fruit trees, it's possible that that is a legacy from this time of some sort, maybe not the exact trees that were planted then. And also, to return to the oaks, during this orchard time, there was a cultural view that oaks were water thieves and had to be removed so orchards could have all the water. So at this point, oaks were considered a very large weed, essentially, and were removed from areas. So you have a massive change in the landscape. You have a big change in the trees we see here. And then you have this guy coming on the scene in about 1886, Joaquin Miller. He is the person Joaquin Miller Park is named after. He was a writer and a poet, and he was very interested in creating an artist retreat. So he started buying parcels of land in the hills where all the redwoods had been until he had about 70 acres. And he started building stone monuments. He built homes for his mother and daughter, and he also planted a ton of trees. So this is the Abbey. This is one of the houses that Joaquin Miller built. I'm assuming he also built this house. So this is the area where he was. This is essentially the area that is now Joaquin Miller Park. So Joaquin Miller coordinated the planting of about 75,000 trees, which is pretty wild. The interesting thing is many of the species he chose were not native to the area. He chose things like Monterey pine, Monterey cypress, olive, eucalyptus, and Monterey pine and Monterey cypress are native to different parts of California, but not native to this particular area of California. So it's just kind of interesting to think about. And I'll talk about those trees in a minute as well. And just as a fun little comparison, this is the Abbey where it is now off of Joaquin Miller Road. And here are the surrounding trees. And I don't know if anybody in the audience knows this, but to my knowledge, the Abbey that Joaquin Miller built has never been moved. I have never heard about it being moved, and I have looked for information about this. So to my knowledge, this is the same place where the Abbey was originally built. I could be wrong about that though, so please let me know if anybody knows differently. But it's pretty interesting just to see all the trees in Joaquin Miller, regardless of where the Abbey used to be, versus, wow, there's no trees. So I bring up Joaquin Miller not only because he planted tons of trees, but also because he kind of started an urban forest. And that's a really big part of our landscape today in Oakland and cities around the world. And this is a super fun chart from an amazing book that I will talk about in just one second. But this is the origin of California's urban trees. And you can see that most of our trees that we have in the street and in our cities are from Australia. And then we have a large portion from East Asia, China, and Japan. Only 6% of our urban trees are from California, and only 9% on top of that are from North America. So it's pretty interesting. We have a very cosmopolitan makeup of urban trees around here. This is the book that I was talking about, A Californian's Guide to the Trees Among Us. If you are interested in learning more about the trees on your street, I can't recommend this book highly enough. It is great. It's super easy to read. You know, if you were to buy a Audubon book, or sorry, not to pick on Audubon, but just any guidebook about trees of the Western United States or trees of North America, you would probably have a really hard time identifying the tree right outside your front door, because chances are it's not from around here. So I highly recommend this book. So I wanted to get into a little bit about the specific urban trees we have around here. Monterey pine is a really common one. This is actually the most widely planted pine in the world. It grows really, really fast. It has really rapid growth, and people love it for lumber and pulp. Now, when it is grown for lumber and pulp, there is a cultivated version of this tree that is used. It's not the wild version. So the cultivated means it's been bred for certain qualities. And it's very, very different from the wild versions of these trees. So even though this is the most commonly planted tree in the world, this is actually threatened in its native range and in its wild habitat. And that's around Santa Cruz and Monterey Peninsula. So in its natural state, it's actually considered rare and endangered as well, because it's also like very twisty and knotty and full of sap and resin and like real bad for lumber. Some identifying characteristics, we've got the 3 needles per fascicle. You have kind of these like, oh, the fascicle is just sort of like this little thing down here that holds the needles together. You have sort of these pointy egg-shaped cones. And their habit is kind of, I don't know a very good way to describe this, kind of tall and bushy looking. And then we have the Monterey cypress. So this is also a very widely cultivated tree. You'll find it in, all over the Western US, in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, but again, it's very rare in the wild and in its native habitat. So one of the things to look for is this like really fibrous, almost silvery bark. Unlike the Monterey pine that I was having a hard time describing the general look of the tree, the Monterey cypress is very, very, very distinct. It has this kind of like these horizontal platforms of leaves. It's just very statuesque. They stand out. So these are pretty easy to pick out of the landscape. And the cones are these cool little soccer ball cones here. And they're actually glued together by pitch. And this is another plant that fire can help germinate. So if there is a low intensity burn, the pitch will melt, the cones will pop open and release the seeds. These cones will also pop open without fire, but fire can help. And the cones will be on the tree and viable for up to 4 years. So if you see a little cone on a tree, that cone might be older than your toddler. And then we had the question from before, the blue gum eucalyptus. So this is, I would say, probably one of the most, if not the most controversial tree in California, in the Bay Area. This was a tree that was introduced to California in the 1850s as a horticultural novelty. But it was later really imported in force for timber. Now, people planted these huge stands of trees because they like grew really fast and like, yeah, we can use all this lumber. So by the early 1900s, it was being planted everywhere for medicine, fuel wood, timber, posts, pilings, railroad ties, you name it. Oh, and also as a street and park tree because it is very picturesque and it smells nice. However, it was discovered that these young blue gum eucalyptus trees had really poor quality timber. So people tried using it in railroad ties, the railroad ties would shatter. It just was not good for lumber. So a lot of the eucalyptus plantations remained uncut. We are kind of still seeing the legacy of that today. There are a lot of different types of eucalyptus. There are over 200 different species in California alone. This is a tree that is from Australia. I believe all the eucalyptus in the world is from Australia. The blue gum eucalyptus is very distinct as far as the bark goes. It's got like, it's very, very shreddy. You'll just see these like ribbons of bark hanging off the tree. But for other eucalyptuses that don't have this very obvious bark, there are a couple things to look for just to figure out whether or not it is a eucalyptus or some other type of tree. A lot of eucalyptus flowers have this sort of like pom-pom ball fireworks look to them. And their seed pods often look like these bells or kind of like acorn caps. So those are two things to look for if you happen to be around a tree that has either the fruit or the flower. And sometimes they're aromatic, but not always. So if you like crush up the leaf and it smells kind of medicinal, maybe it's a eucalyptus, maybe. And then we have these trees, the acacias. And these are all over the place as well. If you've taken a walk around Lake Merritt recently, they're often around the water's edge, kind of around the Adams Point area. This is actually the world's largest tree genus. There are over 1,200 species of acacia. So quite a few, and they're found in warm tropical regions. They're very abundant in Australia, again, so we can kind of think about that urban tree chart that we saw earlier. And they are aggressive reproducers, so they are often considered very weedy and undesired in many places. They are part of the legume family, which is why they have, or lepis, which is why they have these pods here. So that's one thing to look for if you're trying to identify it. And here's a super fun thing that you may or may not already know about acacias, but they have these really cool leaves. So some of the leaves, like the silver wattle acacia, has these fern-like leaves throughout its entire life. A lot of other acacia species, however, have leaves that kind of change. So you might see these like flattened structures here. What'll happen is the young tree will have these fern-like leaves, and as the leaves mature, they will start getting this structure here called a phyllodes. And it's just a flattened leaf stem that also photosynthesizes, but it's not technically a leaf. Whoa, pretty crazy. So if you're looking at an acacia and you see these like two types of leaves, that is what's going on, which is pretty interesting. Our third to last tree is an olive. Mediterranean tree, likely the first non-native tree cultivated in California, probably around the mid-1700s at Mission San Diego. And the first non-native tree cultivated is key there. So this is now a really important agricultural tree in California. It's also grown as park and street and shade trees as well. And this could be another tree we use as a guide for human culture, because it's thought that people have been eating olives for nearly 6,000 years. Another tree with some edibles are the arbutus trees. And these are a tree that do not exist in the wild. They are purely cultivated for ornamental plants, but they are edible. There's a bunch of them around Lake Merritt. You want to look for this like shreddy bark here. They are in the madrone family, so madrones have that shredded bark, as do these trees. And look for these cool fruits here. They have these really pretty bell flowers, and then the fruits are kind of like these like pebbly little berry-looking things. And their wild counterpart, the Latin name is Arbutus unito, which means I eat only one. These are not the most delicious fruits in the world. They kind of taste like bland apricots that are filled with sand. But, you know, it's fun to eat them, and the birds and other animals really like them as well. So not the most amazing fruit, but definitely edible, and a fun thing to do if you're around Lake Merritt and happen to see the trees in fruit. And then finally, the London plane tree. And if you live in Oakland, which our audience might not necessarily live in Oakland, but you might have seen these plants anywhere else as well. This is one of the most widely planted street trees in the world. And it is related to the sycamore. It's a breed between two different plants, the western sycamore and the the oriental plane tree. And this, again, is also a tree that does not exist in the wild. This is purely a cultivar of mysterious origin. But you'll notice, like the wild sycamore, it does have this puzzle piece bark here, and it has these kind of fuzzy ball seeds like the other one. This one has slightly shallower lobed leaves over here, and they look a little bit more maple-like than our California sycamore. Again, that is the tree that's planted all over the sidewalks around Lake Merritt and other parts of Oakland. So this is just a fun guide I made with a community group. It was John Muir Laws's Nature Journaling Club. And I thought that I had the link on hand, but I will make sure to get that to folks before we end today. This is available online. All you have to do is Google a guide to some trees at Lake Merritt, and I'm sure this will pop up. And this is just a little map of some different trees, and then some social and natural history, as well as some identifying information. So this is just a fun little community project that happened a few years ago. So urban forests, it's not necessarily something that we think of when we think about climate solutions or, you know, all kinds of other issues that we're facing in our cultures today, but there are a lot of benefits of urban forests. And by that, I mean parks and gardens and street trees. They actually do a lot. They muffle noise, they mitigate pollution, they allow for energy conservation, they make urban living healthier. Oftentimes when we are in cities, there's a lot of pavement and asphalt that absorbs heat. And if there aren't any trees to create shade, then it can heat up that area of the city very, very quickly. But urban trees do not have an easy life. They have to deal with a lot of things. They have to deal with root constriction. They have to deal with compaction of their roots. and things like pests and air pollution and overhead wires and neglect and vandalism and, of course, drought in California. So there are a number of different organizations, including cities, counties, etc., working on urban forestry. One of the organizations around here is Urban Relief. They've been doing a lot about urban forestry education for years, as well as providing jobs experience for people. And then you have things like different reports that community groups make. This is a really interesting report. It's put together by the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and it's all about how to reintroduce more oaks into Silicon Valley. And the reason I bring this up is because the trees we see on our streets are not growing there by accident. They were very, very intentional. And so while this is different in many ways from Ohlone ancestors intentionally working with the landscape, we can also make the connection that currently urban planners and community groups are very intentionally managing urban forests and the landscapes we live within for the benefit of the people who live here. And so I wanted to bring it back to the redwoods a little bit, to bring it back to our story of change. This is a picture from Redwood Regional Park, and these are some folks affiliated with Save the Redwoods League. And there are people who are studying the redwoods in the hills around Oakland to see how redwood forests are not only affected by climate change, but also how trees can help humans in reducing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. People are finding that young, quickly growing redwoods absorb a ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, more than people originally thought. And so to move on to our guide for change, I wanted to quickly talk about the Emeryville Shell Mound, because I had mentioned the West Berkeley Shell Mound earlier as the biggest and oldest. And this is just kind of leading into that, just so you can get an idea of, this is kind of what shell mounds looked like around here before the material was taken away. And it was taken away for things like agricultural fertilizer and for concrete mordant for all the different buildings that were being built. So this shell mound, unfortunately, is no longer with us. The top part was destroyed, and then the part underground was destroyed by the Bay Street Shopping Center. So there was a lot of opposition to this shopping center when it put in, specifically because it was going to be disturbing a cultural site that was thousands of years old. And today we have, for the past decade, I believe, there has been an annual gathering on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, to protest the idea that a shopping mall was given precedent over maintaining cultural heritage sites. So I bring that up to juxtapose it to another case that is similar but had a very different outcome. And that's the West Berkeley Shell Mound. So this might look like a parking lot, but underneath are the remains of the West Berkeley Shell Mound. And this was a huge shell mound. It was bigger than that Emeryville shell mound that I showed you the picture of. This was as tall as a two-story building, 300 to 400 feet long, and is also the earliest known settlement on the San Francisco Bay. Just to put it in perspective, the pyramids of Egypt are about 4,500 years old, and West Berkeley Shell Mound is about 5,000 years old. So the shell mounds are our pyramids. They are an irreplaceable cultural heritage. So the West Berkeley Shell Mound was under threat because there were developers who wanted to dig up the remains that were underground and put in a combination live-work space. And there was a lot of controversy. It was a pitched legal battle that lasted for years. And the outcome, as of now, is that in October 2019, a judge ruled against development of the property. And because the West Berkeley Shell Mound is a historic structure, even though it has been demolished above the ground. And so the reason that I bring this up is because changing our relationship with the land also includes how we honor heritage indigenous to this land and learning different ways to interact with our environment through multiple cultural lenses. So when we think about oaks or redwoods or culture and change, it is both a short and long-term view. It is both global and local. And the trees have been around a lot longer than we have. So I hope you've learned a couple new things about how these species fit into the natural and social history of the area, as well as into our shared stories. So with that, thank you so much for your time and attention. And if you have any questions, I would love to hear them.
Constance, thank you so much. What a fascinating talk. Like, we really appreciate your enthusiasm and your knowledge and just some of the fascinating things that you shared, and heartbreaking things too, really. So I know there is one question in the chat here. And I was asking if the person wanted to speak out loud, but I haven't heard back. Is it the person with a question about the picture of about Joaquin Miller Park? Would you like to ask your question out loud? If you would, go ahead and write yes in the chat and I can unmute you. Otherwise, I can just read it. And then I will double check over on Facebook. I know we've got about 20 to 30 people watching over there. So hang on just a second.
And feel free to email me later if you've got questions. I love questions because they always kind of show me, help me remember what I know and don't know, and it reminds me to keep doing research. So yeah, if I can't answer your question today, I am happy to get back to you later.
Okay, we have a live question. I'm gonna unmute this person and then hopefully it will work. I think you just have to unmute yourself.
Okay, hi Constance, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, thank you. Hey, I'm enjoying your presentation. Thanks very much for putting it together. And thank you to the library also for offering this.
Okay.
You know, I love that photo of the Joaquin Miller Park Abbey. And that's one of my regular spots that I go to hike and to go birding. But one of the things I notice is there are large swaths of oak woodland there with large oak trees and, you know, the associated understory, scrub species and stuff. And but then I've seen, when I've looked at like some of the galleries in the Oakland main library, and I look at the Oakland hills, so many of them are just barren of trees. And so my question is, why aren't there trees in that photo? I mean, besides the, you know, I know you mentioned that there were trees planted, like the eucalyptus and the acacias, but why does it seem barren of oak trees in those photos? Do you think they were cut down with European contact, or were those hills more prairie and the oaks have colonized since then? What are your thoughts about that?
Boy, that is a really, really good question. And I feel like that's one of the fascinating things about this is it's a little bit of a detective story. So my guess for the series of events is that generally around here, before we had agriculture, we had a lot of grazing. And with grazing, oaks were also considered water thieves because they wanted that water for the grasses, they wanted it for different cattle ponds. And so often oaks were removed from the landscape. And so my first thought is that the reason it's completely denuded is because that area was used for grazing. And so I would imagine that's why it kind of looks so barren, is because it was intentionally cleared. That's my first thought. And I would imagine that as far as the oak savannas that are there now, or like, you know, the oak savanna-ish landscapes that are around there, I wouldn't be surprised if one of two things happened. Either if the city planted those oak trees in order to bring back some of that kind of native landscape area, or if those were volunteer oaks, because we constantly have oak trees sprouting up all over the place. Jays and squirrels and lots of wildlife will, you know, stash the acorns around. And, you know, I've had acorns growing out of like a crack in a sidewalk outside my house, tiny little sidewalk oak trees. And so they're very hardy. And so it wouldn't surprise me if some of those oak trees might have been volunteers as well. A lot's happened between Joaquin Miller days and now, so it's possible. And then as far as maybe how the grass gets maintained, there is grazing that happens in a lot of the parks, often with goats in places like Joaquin Miller, where it's a little bit more difficult to get cows. And that grazing is actually something that helps keep the grass down and helps it from overgrowing and building up into fire fuels. So the too long didn't read version of my answer to your question is it was probably grazing area, and then oaks were probably either planted by people or volunteers. And I know that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but that's what I got for you off the top of my head.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's encouraging, just that they could make a comeback so quickly too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, if you want to put your email somewhere, send it to, you can send it to me. I am happy to do a little more research on that, because that's a really good question. And I'm not 100% sure if there is any more information out there to know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Constance, we have a couple more chat questions. I have one, they're actually both about the Ohlone peoples. The first question is, where can we find more information about shell mound prior to colonization?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question is, when you talk about a thriving Ohlone culture being in the Bay Area today, are there places that we can go to sort of learn more about that culture or encounter folks who are interested in sharing?
Absolutely, yeah. And I would encourage, if other listeners and audience members have things that they want to share about those two questions, please put them in the chats, because I'm sure that you know things that I do not. So to answer the first question, how to learn more about shell mounds, there is the West Berkeley Shell Mound site has a lot of amazing information. I would highly recommend going there as your first stop. It is an organization that is part of Segorite Land Trust, which is another organization. That website I suggest you check out for more info. Segorite Land Trust is a organization led by Indigenous women who are working to rematriate parts of the Bay Area and return land to Indigenous sovereignty and stewardship around the Bay Area and California as well. So yeah, I would say the first place to go for shell mound information would be the Save West Berkeley Shell Mound. There's some really, really good stuff there. And then the second question, which was, Ohlone culture today. Segorite Land Trust as well. You might have seen signs around Oakland that say pay Shumi land tax. That is kind of all part of the push to have more funding and more resources for Ohlone cultures and Ohlone groups. The Shumi land tax is related to Segorite Land Trust. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go to their website and learn more. There's Cafe Ohlone, which is it is bringing back Ohlone food culture. And that was a restaurant that operated out of, is it the University Bookstore? I'm totally blanking on the name of the bookstore, which has unfortunately since closed since COVID. And so Ohlone Cafe is working on trying to get pre-packaged meal kits that you can subscribe to and then get. And so it's things like, blackberry infused or bay laurel infused blackberry jam with hazelnut scones and, venison steaks. It's like very kind of combining Ohlone food culture as well as Bay Area foodie culture. And where else? There is the Ohlone gathering that happens at Coyote Hills every year. That is a gathering of a lot of different Indigenous tribes around the Bay Area, sharing culture, doing demonstrations, playing games. That's a really great place to go as well. It's open to the public. Anybody can go. It's free. There's also the Big Time Powwow over on the other side of the Bay. I know a lot less about that one, but I am pretty sure it's annually. Again, with COVID, I don't know what's going to be happening with these things. But yeah, those are some places to start. And you can also check out like the Intertribal Friendship House, which is the first urban reservation in Oakland and the country. And they often have different events and things like that. So I'm not 100% sure what's coming up online, but as far as digital events, but those are some places to check out. And again, if folks want to give me your emails, I'm happy to kind of try to write some stuff down for you as well, because that was a lot of rapid fire information.
I see in the chat that there's an Ohlone big time gathering at Rob Hill Campground.
Rob Hill, thank you.
USF. And then over on Facebook, someone has just shared the link for the Segorite Land Trust, so that we can include that. So what we will do is we will take the video of this and post it on our Facebook, YouTube. This video will also be continue to exist on Facebook. Did I say Facebook, YouTube? It's the end of my night. I apologize if I'm speaking strangely. So we will, the video, we will post it on our YouTube. We will include links to the 3 books that Constance mentioned, as well as the PDF for trees in Lake Merritt, and maybe the Segorite Land Trust, and maybe a few other things of interest. I do have for you, if you have time, a link to a questionnaire about the program. So if you have a moment and you can tell me if you liked the program, if you didn't like the program, if you'd like to see more programs or less programs, whatever you may think about programs, we would sure appreciate it. Constance, did you have any final words for us?
You know, I don't, you know, one final thought that came to me as I was putting this presentation together is I was almost thinking of like, you know, the West Berkeley shell mound being like the stump of an old growth redwood. You know, it's underground, and then we have shoots coming up and creating the next generation. So that was kind of an analogy that came to my mind as I was thinking about, you know, our human culture as well as the culture of the trees and other life around us.
Well, so thank you so much. I think we're at about an hour or two, maybe an hour 10. So maybe it's time to say good night. We're really grateful to you again, Constance, and to East Bay Regional Parks for employing you to come and tell us all of these amazing facts and show us the great pictures. It was really an enjoyable talk. So thank you so much to everybody that's listening. I hope you will come see us at the library. Come pick up some books, say hi. We miss you. We wish you could come inside, maybe someday soon. Okay, everybody stay safe, get some clean air.
Yes, and thank you to you, and thanks for everybody for joining us tonight.
Good night.
All right, good night.